but after what we just heard, I can't evade the temptation to tell you my Czech story. Because when the Russians invaded, I happened to be in Vienna for no particular reason. And I got into a conversation with a couple of Czech students who were trying to decide whether to go home. Now, I don't swear the following story is right, because we were not communicating in a language that either of us was fluent in. But I think what the conversation came to was that they were explaining that what they wanted to do in Czechoslovakia was to use the free market for most things, but have the government take care of providing really essential things like milk and bread. And I said, well, if that's right, if the market is really better for the inessential things, isn't it even more important to use it for the essential things? And I think the answer was yes. That's what our professor says too. So I figured I knew why the Russians had invaded. But this talk, I want to start out by saying that in my observation, a lot of libertarian talks, like a lot of talks to other groups, consist of preaching to the converted, of telling people that they're smart and the people who disagree with them are stupid, and they're good and the people who disagree with them are wicked. And I don't think this is a productive activity. It doesn't convince anybody who doesn't already agree with you, and it makes your audience less able to convince other people. Because if you believe that everybody who disagrees with you is stupid and evil, it is rather unlikely that when you talk to them you will be very persuasive. I therefore try to make my talks either some new set of ideas or things that people in the audience don't agree with. And this one hopefully is in the second category, because my topic is arguments libertarians shouldn't make. And I want to start with one very popular one, and that's what usually gets labeled the NAP, the non-agression postulate or principle or whatever it is, which is often viewed as a sort of a bright line argument where you can say, well, look, you people want to do X, Y, or Z, and here are your reasons for it, but doing that initiates coercion against people, therefore we know it's bad. And I think there are two things wrong with this argument. The first is nobody really believes it. And the second is that defining what is or isn't initiating coercion is a much harder problem than we usually assume. And I want to start with the first half of this. And I want to use an argument which I think, an example that I think goes back to Bill Bradford, who was the editor of Liberty magazine for many years. You are sitting on the balcony of your 10th floor apartment, and somehow you carelessly fall off. Luckily, the 9th floor apartment below you has a flagpole. You catch hold of the flagpole, and you're going hand over hand along the flagpole to get onto the balcony, to get into the apartment, to get to the elevator and get back to your apartment. When the owner of the 9th floor apartment comes out onto the balcony, he says, "Excuse me, I have not given you permission to use my flagpole. Please let go." Would any of you let go? I think very, very few libertarians would yet go. And yet if you really believe our rhetoric, which says you should never initiate coercion, you're initiating coercion by using his property without his permission, therefore you must be wrong, therefore you should let go. So that's the simplest case. For a slightly less exotic case, which I think I'm responsible for, imagine that there is a madman with a gun who is shooting into a crowd of people. And it just so happens that next to you is a rifle, which you could use to shoot the madman. However, you know it is the property of a curmudgeon who has publicly stated that he never wants anybody to ever use his rifle for any purpose without his permission. And the question is, do you take the rifle and shoot the madman or not? Now, I don't think it's quite as clear. I think there are going to be some libertarians who will say not. But my guess is that most would say that you should. And my final example, which is an entirely implausible science fictional one, is that there is an asteroid headed for Earth. If it hits the Earth, it will wipe out all life on Earth. It happens that there is some way of stopping it, which unfortunately requires you to steal something worth a nickel from its just owner. And this just owner is a fellow who doesn't much like his fellow men, and he's made it perfectly clear that whether or not it saves the lives of everybody else, including him, he doesn't want that thing stolen. And I think most of us would agree that under those circumstances, you steal the thing worth a nickel. And the point of all of these examples is that what we really believe is not that you should never initiate coercion, but that initiating coercion is a bad thing, that it is a good rule of thumb not to do it. The fact that something involves initiating coercion is a strong argument against doing it, but it's not an absolute knockdown argument, which is what our rhetoric often pretends that it is. The second problem with this line of argument is that the more you think about it, the less clear it becomes just what counts as initiating coercion. And my standard example here is that we would probably all agree that if somebody fires a megawatt laser through the window of your living room, he is coercing you. He is trespassing on your property. How about if from your living room you can see the light in his room a quarter mile off? The fact that you can see that light means that there are photons he is producing which are trespassing, which are coming through the glass of your window and hitting your eyes. So that's just a difference of degree between that and the megawatt laser, and yet we almost certainly don't want to say that he doesn't have a right to turn on his light if you can see it. And part of the fun of learning about the law, I've been spending most of the last 30-some years applying economics to the law. That's been my specialty. Is that when you start looking at the law, you realize that concepts that both economists and libertarians think of as simple aren't really simple. And one of those is, what does it mean to own a piece of land? That we sort of like to think, well, it means you own all the rights associated with that piece of land. But that's impossible, because some rights are associated with two adjacent pieces of land, such as your right to turn on lights in your property that I can see from mine. Or to take an example from the common law, your right to dig a hole at the border of your property into which my house slides. All right, have you violated my rights or have I violated yours? English common law, the answer is that the ownership of property includes the right of lateral support, which means that I have the right not to have you remove the dirt that is keeping my house from sliding into your property. But whether that ought to be the rule is not immediately obvious. It's a fairly complicated question that really, when you own a piece of property, a piece of land, say, what you own is a bundle of rights associated with that land, and it's not a priori obvious what ought to be in that bundle. That could be a talk all by itself, but it's not going to be. So what I think we ought to argue is not to claim that this is some absolute bright line rule that gives you final answers to all questions, but only to claim that first, non-violation of rights, individual freedom, is a value in itself. It's something that we ought to be in favor of. Second, that it is a mechanism for producing other things we ought to be in favor of. That is to say, most people prefer a world where people are not starving, where they have nice houses, a bunch of other things, and we've got a whole lot of arguments out of economics and libertarianism suggesting that we're more likely to get those outcomes if people don't go around violating other people's rights than if they do. So I think that the less extreme argument has the advantage of being true, and therefore is the one that we ought to be making. Right. Let me go to my second example of an argument libertarians ought not to make, and that's the claim that if you have a free market, if you have a laissez-faire system, all problems are solved, that anything that ought to happen will happen. And again, the trouble with this claim is that it isn't true. And the reason it isn't true is an idea that is referred to by economists as market failure. And market failure, like a lot of technical terms, sounds as though it explains itself and doesn't. There are ways in which markets can fail that are not market failure. And market failure exists in lots of places other than markets. And that, again, is something I sometimes give a talk on. That's not this talk. But let me at least describe what I think market failure is. Market failure describes a situation where individual rationality does not produce group rationality. So to take a real-world example this time that I actually observed some, 30 or 40 years ago, there is an intersection just south of UCLA in Los Angeles, which the locals claim is the busiest intersection in the world, or at least claimed then was. There's probably one in China by now that's busier. And what you would see every day is that the traffic is coming across here, and the light starts to turn, and the last few cars try to get across, and the result is that when the light goes green this way, the intersection is jammed with cars. So these people can't go. They gradually filter out just in time for the traffic come this way, light goes red and jams it. Everybody would get home sooner if everybody politely refrained from going into the intersection unless they were sure they could get across. But every single driver is acting correctly in terms of his own self-interest, because the driver who pulls in this way is imposing costs on these people, the driver who pulls in this way is imposing costs on these people, and each person is correctly maximizing his benefits net of his costs. All right? You can have lots and lots of other examples. My usual dramatic example is one from ancient warfare. I want to imagine that it's about 10,000 miles east of here, about 1,000 years ago. You're one of a line of 10,000 men with spears. Spears are pointing that way. The reason they're pointing that way is there are 10,000 other guys, only they're on horseback, and they have spears too, and they're coming at you. And you do a very quick cost-benefit calculation. And you say, if we all stand and keep our spears planted, with luck we will break their charge. And some of us will die, but many of us will live. If we run, horses run faster than we do. I should stand. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. I said we. I don't control him and him. If they run and I stand, I'm dead. If they stand and I run, 1 man out of 10,000 doesn't have much effect on whether we stop the charge, and I won't be one of the ones killed. Everybody does this calculation. We all run. Most of us die. Welcome to the dark side of rationality. All right? These all have the same pattern. What's happening in each case is that someone is making a decision where he either does not get the benefit or does not pay the cost. He is maximizing benefit minus cost for himself, but that results in a other than maximum benefits minus cost for the whole group. I'm imposing costs on you, you're imposing costs on me. Each of us is acting correctly in his own interests. We're all worse off as a result. This exists in private markets. It is a reason why there are some situations in which laissez-faire gives you the wrong answer. However, the correct argument is not to say it doesn't exist, but to point out that the conditions that lead to market failure are the exception on the private market and the norm on the public market. That after all, in private market transactions, you usually have to pay for your inputs. To get people to work for you, you've got to pay them enough so they'd rather do that than anything else. You usually get paid for your outputs because you can sell them. So most of the time, the sort of normal situation in the market environment is that you do indeed bear the costs and get the benefits of your actions. On the other hand, if you think of people acting in the political marketplace, it is essentially never the case that people are bearing the costs and receiving the benefits. That if an individual voter spends a whole lot of time and effort deciding who's the better candidate for president, he increases the chance of the right guy winning by about 1 in 4 million. And if, by some phenomenally unlikely event, it actually determines who wins, that benefit is being shared with 300 million Americans. So that's a case of an externality of 99.99999%. All right? So therefore, a rational voter, unless he finds studying politics entertaining, as some of us do, but as far as simply getting the right guy elected, the rational thing to do is to flip a coin, or probably better, to vote for whoever your friends want you to vote for, because then they'll like you. And most of us are poor liars, so it's easier to say you voted for somebody if you did. So the result is what economists refer to as rational ignorance, which describes the usual pattern of voting in, I think, any large population democracy, including this one. Similarly, if you think about judges making decisions, a judge sets a precedent. If it turns out to be a bad precedent, the national income of the U.S. goes down by 0.001%. The judge never knows that. It's much too small an effect for him to see. He isn't bearing the costs. 0.001% of whatever the current national income is, I don't know, 8 trillion or something, is a very large amount of money. Huge amount of damage for one person to do. No reason he should know. If I had more time, I would tell you my favorite horror story of a decision setting a precedent that almost certainly resulted in many people dying, which depended on a mathematical mistake that a smart high school kid should have been ashamed of making. If you want to talk about it afterwards, I can give you that example. But in any case, so the basic point I'm making is that the wrong argument is to say the market will always give you the right answer. The right argument is to say the reasons why the market occasionally gives the wrong answer are reasons why the alternative to the market frequently gives the wrong answer, and therefore transferring decisions from the private market to the political market is usually a bad idea. Usually results in worse results, in more market failure, not less. Right. Let me go on to my third example, and this is a somewhat narrower issue, the issue of climate change, which I've been arguing with people about for about 15 years now, following out an argument that I got into about 40-some years ago over population growth. The two arguments that I see people who are critical of the orthodoxy making are either that climate change isn't happening or that it's not due to human beings. Both of these are very weak arguments. I think it is pretty clear that since about 1911, average global temperatures have been trending up. And while climate is a very complicated system, so it's hard to be sure of reasons, I think the most plausible explanation is that it's in large part due to increased CO2 in the atmosphere. Physics are perfectly straightforward. You would expect it to raise temperatures. It's a complicated system, so it's not clear how much you would expect it to. The estimates of what's called climate sensitivity, which is the amount of warming you get for a given increase in CO2, vary over about a factor of 3, from about 1 to 3. So it's entirely possible that humans are responsible for part of it and something else for another part. But nonetheless, it's not an unreasonable theory. Furthermore, it doesn't really matter very much whether humans are responsible. That's the odd thing in the whole argument, that both sides somehow have to think that the crucial question is it our fault? Suppose it's not our fault. Suppose it were really true that the Earth is warming, which it is, that warming is going to have terrible effects, which is probably not true, but suppose it were true. We would then want to figure out how to do something about it, whether or not it was our fault. And yet there is this sort of basic psychological feeling, if it's our fault, we have to fix it. If it's not our fault, we don't have to fix it. Crazy part of that particular argument. But in any case, what I want to claim is that the real argument against the orthodoxy is that we have no good reason to believe that climate change will make us worse off. And it is quite unlikely that it will make us a whole lot worse off. That if you think about it, human beings presently prosper across a range of climates much larger than the predicted change. As I like to put it, if the IPCC is right in their more pessimistic estimates, by the end of this century, Minnesota will be about as warm as Iowa is now. And Iowa, I've been through it a few times. It doesn't seem to be a, roasting place where nobody can grow anything. So I think the right thing to do is to attack that argument. And this gets me back to the question of population, because back, say, 40-some years ago, I think, I was asked to do a piece on population from a pro-market standpoint. There was a private organization called the Population Council. The person who ran it, who as far as I know was a conventional liberal, I'm not sure, but if so, a very open-minded one, thought that everybody who was writing about population was doing it from a left-of-center point of view, and he'd like to see what the view of population issues was from the other side. So he asked me to write something, and I wrote a piece. It's on my webpage if people want to look at it. And all I did was to try to figure out the net externality from having one more child. That is to say, if you have one more child, if you take the amount by which that benefits the rest of the world, subtract it from it the amount by which it harms the rest of the world, is the sum positive or negative? All right? Because what was happening was that everybody worried about population only looked at the negatives. And they all thought it was terrible. My conclusion was that I could not sign the sum. That the benefits and costs were sufficiently uncertain that I couldn't tell whether the net effect was positive or negative. Apparently I was right. That is to say, we didn't do anything drastic about population except in China. And the poor parts of the world got less poor rather than more poor, less hungry rather than more hungry, which was the opposite of what people were predicting would happen. So when I got interested in the climate issues much later, I tried to think about the same question. I can't put numbers to it very well, but I tried to list the positive and the negative effects. There are two different ways you can look at the whole question. One of them is a priori. Is there a reason to expect warming to make us worse off? And the other is point by point. What are the different ways in which it changes? For the first one, there is one reason to expect climate change in either direction to make us worse off, and that's the fact that we're currently optimized against our current environment. So that the houses people build in any particular place are those houses designed for that climate. The crops they grow are those crops that grow well with that particular amount of warmth and rainfall and all the rest of it. So therefore, anytime you change, you have your existing decisions. They are no longer optimal against your new environment. So that's a priori reason to think change is bad. But it's not a very serious reason unless the change is rapid. That if you think about it, over 100 years, most houses will get replaced, and the ones that won't get replaced are likely to get modified. Most farmers will switch crop varieties several times. The irrigation technology will change. So if over 100 years the environment changes a little bit, and we're talking now, so far warming has been about 1 degree centigrade per century. So you're talking about maybe, if it goes faster, maybe 2 or 3 degrees centigrade. That's still a pretty small effect. If that happens, that will not have very significant costs for human beings. It will have some cost for human beings. It's a stronger argument for other species. I think the biggest uncertainty to me is the effect of climate change on non-human species. Trees, for example, don't move very fast, and so it might turn out that there are substantial forests which, when things warm a little bit more, certain insects that prey on those forests don't freeze during the winter, and therefore some forests end up with problems. And you can think of similar problems for other species. But nonetheless, that's the only argument a priori that I can see for its being worse. There are 2 arguments for thinking that warming due to climate change will be a good thing. 2 a priori arguments. One of them is that it turns out that if you look at the physics of the greenhouse effect, you expect more warming in cold times and places than in hot times and places. This has to do with the interaction between CO2 and water vapor. That water vapor is a strong greenhouse gas. The warmer it is, the more water vapor is in the air. And the more of one greenhouse gas is in the air, the less the effect of adding another one. You can't take out more than 100% of the long wave radiation coming off the Earth. All right? So that means that on the whole, we can expect greenhouse gas warming to be more in winter than in summer, more in cold parts of the world than in hot parts of the world. On the whole, warmth is nice when it's cold and bad when it's hot. So that means that the pattern of the warming is actually biased in our favor. Second reason is that if you look at the globe, you observe that the equator is populated and the poles are not. That is, human land use is limited almost entirely by cold, not by heat. There are places that are both hot and dry, like the Sahara, where you don't use the land very much, but all of Antarctica is essentially a desert. Right? And a good deal of the stuff of the far north in Alaska and Siberia and places like that. So that means that as you warm things, temperature contours push towards the poles, and the amount of land usable by human beings increases. All right? So that's a second reason why you would expect there to be some benefits. If you then try to list sort of individual things, sea level rise is real, but if you actually look at the numbers, it's pretty small. That you're talking, the estimate in the last IPCC report for 2100 on the high emission scenario, the high end of that estimate is about 1 meter of sea level rise, maybe just over 1 meter. The rule of thumb for the U.S. southeast coast, I came across in an old book, is that a foot of sea level rise moves the coast by about 100 feet. So that means that 1 meter means the coastline moves in by about 100 meters. If you think about imagining a map, you can't see a 100-meter change. All right, it's a tiny, tiny change. I tried to do a very rough estimate once of how much land you lost from sea level rise versus how much land you gained from temperature contours moving towards the poles. And I concluded that the second number was something between 100 and 1,000 times as large as the first. Now, that doesn't tell you which is more important, because coastal land tends to be valuable. So I'm not claiming that I can be sure that one is bigger than the other, but only that it is far from clear that the net effect from that standpoint is negative. There turns out to be one big positive effect which mostly gets ignored by people who are arguing that that global warming is a catastrophe, and that's CO2 fertilization. CO2 is an input to photosynthesis. It's been used deliberately to increase plant yield for a long time in greenhouses. Roughly speaking, if you double the CO2 concentration, the yield of most crop plants goes up by about 30%. Turns out there are two mechanisms for photosynthesis called C3 and C4. Most crop plants are C3. Maize and sugarcane are C4. They're the big exception. C4, it still goes up, but not by as much. But in any case, so that's a big positive effect. So the argument that I think we ought to be making, that I've been making for a long time, is there are both positive and negative effects. Both of them are quite uncertain for a whole bunch of different reasons. We don't know how much CO2 we'll put in the atmosphere. We don't know how sensitive the temperature is to CO2 increase. We don't know when the climate changes, to what degree farmers will benefit or lose. They get longer growing seasons, but in some places they have more crop pests because of warmer winters and so forth and so on. But nonetheless, it seems to me the right argument is that it is quite likely that the net effects will be positive, and there's no good reason to expect them to be large and negative, which is what almost everybody is claiming in this discussion. So again, I think that in talking about climate change, it's a very simple argument to say it isn't happening. The only trouble is it isn't true. And similarly for these other ones. And that therefore the arguments you ought to be making are the much more complicated arguments, which involve there is no a priori reason to expect climate change to be bad, or rather there are a priori reasons both to expect it to be bad and to expect it to be good. And we don't know what the net effect will be. And there are no good reasons, if you look at individual changes, to think the net effect will be bad, although it could turn out to be bad. It might turn out that the effects I think are good are smaller than I think, that the effects I think are bad are larger. I think the biggest uncertainty to me is what's referred to as acidification of the ocean. And that's a slightly misleading term because the ocean is basic. So what's really happening is it's becoming less basic as CO2 dissolves in the water. CO2 dissolved in the water is carbonic acid. It's the stuff you get when you drink your sodas. And putting that into a base solution, which is what basic solution, which the ocean is, makes it a little less basic. That making the ocean more neutral doesn't mean that it will dissolve people away, which is what acidification makes you think of. But it does mean that it will be less suited to organisms that are currently optimized against the current pH of the ocean. So I don't think we know enough to know if that's going to be a trivial problem or a large problem, if that's going to have a large effect on things like fish, which we eat quite a lot of, or a small effect. But there may well be other things I haven't thought about or haven't thought enough about. So I think it's a mistake. I was actually, a week or so ago, I was at the International Students for Liberty convention in D.C., and I think possibly for the first time in my life, I was in an argument where I was arguing that global warming was worse, not better, than the person I was talking to thought, because he was claiming that increasing CO2 made us better off, and my claim was we don't know. It might make us better off, it might not. So that was an interesting experience. All right, so let me see if I can sort of sum up what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that we shouldn't make bad arguments, tempting though it often is. And we shouldn't make bad arguments, first because honesty is a virtue. It's a part of being a good person, at least in my opinion. And second, because bad arguments drive away smart people. That if you use bad arguments, some stupid people will be convinced. Smart people will say, oh, that's what libertarians are. They're people who make these silly hand-waving arguments no one should take seriously. And on the whole, we are better off attracting smart people than attracting stupid people. Thank you. Happy to take questions if there is time, but I don't know if there is.